What happens when a prince crosses the line and finds himself abandoned by his own nation? Not just mocked in headlines, not just the target of tabloid fodder, but legally, symbolically, and possibly forever. Stripped of everything that once defined him? That moment may have arrived, because something unprecedented just erupted in the United Kingdom, and it didn't come from Buckingham Palace. It didn't come from King Charles, and it didn't come from the high walls of royal protocol. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. No, it came from the people. A bombshell petition, launched with little fanfare but erupting into viral wildfire, has now forced the UK Parliament to publicly respond to a question no one in the royal family ever wanted to hear. Should Prince Harry, Duke of Sussex, son of King Charles III, be stripped of his royal rights permanently? This isn't just internet chatter anymore. This isn't another tabloid stunt. The petition gained more than 100,000 signatures in record time, activating an official parliamentary debate response. For a constitutional monarchy built on tradition and pageantry, this is as close to revolution as it gets. And the timing? Chilling. Harry, once hailed as the cheeky, beloved son of Princess Diana, has become a lightning rod of controversy. His explosive memoir Spare wasn't just personal, it was political. His lawsuits against the British press? Not just litigious, but confrontational. His global interviews, Netflix specials, California lifestyle, Hollywood reinvention, private jet lectures on climate change, and thinly veiled attacks on his own family have led many to a singular question. How much is too much? And who decides? The monarchy never responds directly. That's their golden rule. But Parliament? Parliament must respond to the people. What makes this even more extraordinary is the stark reversal of public opinion. Just a few years ago, Prince Harry and Meghan Markle were seen as modernizers, the glamorous duo who could drag the dusty monarchy into the 21st century. Now, for many, they symbolize arrogance, hypocrisy, and betrayal. So how did we get here? How did Harry go from people's prince to public pariah? From war veteran and mental health champion to a man millions now want legally disconnected from the crown? And what does it mean, legally, constitutionally, symbolically? If Parliament actually supports the idea, is this a symbolic slap on the wrist, or the beginning of Harry's final exile? Let's rewind the clock. It began with a whisper. A few online voices, angry over Harry's lawsuits, his attempts to fund private security while rejecting royal responsibilities. But then, those whispers turned into hashtags, and those hashtags turned into organized action. A parliamentary petition launched quietly. Some thought it would never be noticed. But within hours, it spread like wildfire. Signatures poured in, tens of thousands, then hundreds of thousands. The number shocked even insiders in Whitehall. This wasn't just an angry fringe. This was the British public, speaking directly to power. And Parliament had no choice but to listen. Now here's the kicker. These petitions don't automatically change the law. They don't instantly yank titles or exile wayward royals. But once that threshold of 100,000 signatures is crossed, the government is legally obliged to respond, and the House of Commons must consider debate. And in the UK, that consideration means everything, because it means silence is no longer an option. The petition's wording is fierce. It calls on Parliament to urge King Charles to remove all remaining royal rights, styles, and privileges from Prince Harry, including his Duke of Sussex title, his HRH status, and any remaining links to UK state functions. It's a demand for a clean break. And here's the twist. This isn't coming from the anti-monarchy movement. This isn't republicanism. This is monarchists, people who believe deeply in the institution, demanding that the institution protect itself by amputating the infected limb. There's a deep sense of betrayal. To many, Harry represents a violation of trust. He swore loyalty to the crown, wore the uniform, pledged allegiance. But then he walked away and began firing missiles from afar. Literal lawsuits against British media institutions, interviews suggesting racism in the royal household, and all of it while clinging to the benefits of his princely image. The contradiction is unbearable. You can't have it both ways. You can't market yourself as a persecuted outsider while retaining the prestige of an inner circle royal. You can't sign million-dollar deals with Netflix on the back of your royal identity, while simultaneously suing the UK government to pay for your security. At least, that's the sentiment driving the petition. But now things have escalated beyond sentiment. Sources close to the palace are reportedly in panic. There are fears that parliamentary pressure, while technically outside the crown's control, may force King Charles to act. That's the real story here. Because behind closed doors, a nightmare scenario is playing out. What if Parliament debates this petition live on air? What if MPs, from across parties, stand up in the House of Commons and publicly question Prince Harry's role? What if this becomes not just a petition, but a political football? Could it trigger a constitutional dilemma? Could it fracture the royal family even further? And here's the most painful twist of all. Insiders say there are royals who quietly agree with the petition. Princess Anne has reportedly voiced harsh words behind closed doors about Harry's privileges without responsibilities. Prince William has allegedly said nothing, but his silence is deafening. Even King Charles is said to be torn. This is his son, but also a growing liability. Is he willing to strip away everything to preserve the monarchy? Or is he frozen, paralyzed between blood and duty? And while all of this unfolds, Meghan remains silent in the press, but her allies have been anything but. Social media accounts connected to her fanbase have erupted in fury, suggesting racism, revenge, and imperial control are at the heart of this movement. One source even hinted that a major new media push may be coming, an explosive counter-narrative. But could that backfire? Because for many British citizens, it's not about race or jealousy or outdated protocol. It's about fairness. It's about the idea that you can't continuously attack your family and still expect to benefit from its name. You can't burn the bridge and expect to walk across it again. And that's what this petition symbolizes. Not just outrage, but a reckoning. Because the people have spoken, and now Parliament must respond. The next few days, weeks, even hours, could reshape everything. What if this petition doesn't go away? What if it actually gains political traction? What if this forces the king into a decision he's been avoiding for years? And what if, deep inside the palace, a final plan is already being drawn? One thing is clear, this isn't just about one prince. It's about the survival of an ancient institution. And the boy who was once its greatest hope may now be its greatest threat. But what comes next, no one saw coming. Because behind the scenes of Parliament's chaos, someone within the royal family is pushing for action. And they might just have the power to finish what the people started. What does it say about a prince when it's the citizens, his own countrymen, who move to sever his final ties to the throne? Not quietly, not subtly, but through a public, legally recognized petition that forces the British Parliament to respond. This wasn't some fringe campaign cooked up by conspiracy theorists in a dingy basement. This was official, public, sanctioned by the very government Prince Harry once represented on royal tours across the Commonwealth. And what began as a murmur, a digital ripple in a vast sea of public discontent, has now become a thunderous roar. But let's rewind to the moment that roar began. It started with one click. One citizen, whose name may never be known, submitted a petition to the official UK Parliament petitions website. The wording was simple, almost surgical. We call on His Majesty's government to request the King strip Prince Harry, Duke of Sussex, of all remaining royal rights and titles. Direct. No frills. No emotion. Just a line in the sand. At first, no one noticed. In fact, many believed it would fade into digital obscurity, like thousands of petitions before it. After all, Parliament receives these proposals all the time, on everything from tax reform to environmental issues to silly internet jokes. But this one hit a nerve. Because the petition didn't appear in a vacuum. It followed months, years, of what many in the UK saw as Harry's slow, deliberate disassociation from British values. His walkouts, his tell-all interviews, his Netflix deal, his court battles, his memoir, his jabs at the press, the police, the monarchy, and, worst of all, his own family. And in the aftermath of Spare, when Harry's words ignited a media inferno, something shifted in the public mood. People weren't just offended. They were exhausted. Exhausted by the contradictions. Exhausted by the victimhood narrative. Exhausted by a man who seemed to want royal privilege without royal accountability. So when that petition hit the site, It didn't fizzle. It detonated. Within 24 hours, it had 5,000 signatures. By the end of the week, over 50,000. And by the second week, it crossed the 100,000 mark required to force Parliament's hand. The system is simple, but powerful. Once a petition on the official UK government site hits that six-figure threshold, the House of Commons must consider it for debate. Ministers can no longer ignore it. A formal response becomes mandatory, and that's exactly what happened. But let's pause for a moment and ask, why did this petition explode when so many others languish? Because timing matters, and context is everything. Just weeks before the petition gained traction, Prince Harry had launched yet another legal appeal over the loss of taxpayer-funded police protection during his UK visits. The British media dubbed it the security saga, and public opinion was scathing. How can you abandon your royal duties, move to California, sign with Netflix, and then demand the British people pay to guard you when you pop back in? Asked one editorial in The Telegraph. It was a fair question, and that question lit a match. Fueled by talk radio outrage, social media algorithms, and a bubbling tide of royal fatigue, the petition struck gold. British citizens, fed up with what they saw as hypocrisy, shared it like wildfire. Twitter, Facebook, Reddit, WhatsApp groups, even TikTok. What began as a policy gripe turned into a symbolic crusade. It wasn't just about security, or money, or the technicalities of royal status. It became about respect. Respect for an institution that, while imperfect, still means something to millions. Respect for the late Queen Elizabeth II. Respect for the idea that titles mean duty, not drama. And Harry, for many, had crossed a line. But here's the twist. The petition itself didn't spell out legal action. It didn't demand Parliament remove Harry's titles. That's the King's prerogative. It asked that Parliament recommend the King do so. Still, the symbolism was enough to send shockwaves through Westminster. Because when 100,000 citizens rise up and say enough is enough, politicians start to sweat. Let's not forget, Parliament rarely meddles in royal matters. There's an unwritten agreement, centuries old, that the monarchy remains above politics. But when the people speak this loudly, that line begins to blur. Inside Parliament, aides scrambled. Some MPs called for caution, privately urging colleagues to ignore the petition lest it embarrass the crown. Others, eager for press exposure, began drafting statements. A handful of MPs, especially from conservative backbenches, quietly signaled support. One anonymous member of Parliament told a reporter, "If this were any other citizen, we'd have revoked their privileges ages ago. Harry has mocked our institutions while exploiting his lineage. Enough." But others disagreed. Some MPs feared the debate could turn into a circus, that it might provoke a constitutional crisis, or worse, that it might turn Harry into a martyr. And amidst all this noise, the palace remained silent. Not a word, not a leak, not a whisper, which only amplified the tension. Because if the palace won't defend Harry, who will? Let's pause again and consider the deeper emotional undercurrent. At its heart, this petition isn't just about Harry. It's about Britain's relationship with itself. A country once proud of its stoic, duty-first monarchy now finds itself torn, caught between nostalgia and modernity, between tradition and celebrity culture, between the stiff upper lip of Elizabeth II's era and the therapeutic oversharing of Harry's California interviews. And in that gap, this petition roared, because the British people are asking, what does royalty mean in 2025? Is it a brand? A bloodline? A burden? Or is it simply a fantasy that no longer fits the times? Harry's actions, intentional or not, have forced this reckoning. He's peeled back the curtain. He's aired the family laundry. He's challenged the very structure that once gave him purpose. And in doing so, he's become a mirror. For better or worse, his journey reflects the monarchy's struggle to stay relevant in a cynical, media-saturated world. But if Harry is the mirror, the petition is the hammer. A call to shatter what no longer fits, to break the illusion, to sever ties. And now, Parliament must decide whether to wield that hammer or put it down. What happens next is unclear. But one thing is certain. The people have spoken, and the House of Commons is listening. Still, as this movement gathered steam, the real political explosion hadn't happened yet. Not in public, not on camera, but deep inside the oak-paneled rooms of Westminster, something unexpected was stirring. Because just as the petition crossed 150,000 signatures, an old, familiar voice, one who rarely speaks, and even more rarely breaks ranks, was about to do the unthinkable. Speak out. And what she said would change everything. When do the walls of Westminster start to shake? Not from protest, not from war, but from silence so loud, so heavy, it pulls every eye toward it. Because at first, when the petition exploded past the 100,000 signature mark, Parliament did what it always does when the subject is too hot to handle. It waited. MPs looked the other way. Press officers dodged calls. Lords cleared their throats and pivoted to tax policy. A handful of media figures tried to press the issue, but all they got were icy smiles and shrugs. The unwritten rule was clear: don't touch the Sussex powder keg. At least, not yet. But the silence didn't calm anything. It festered. It expanded. It created a vacuum, and that vacuum started pulling everything in: public fury, tabloid headlines, op-eds, pundit rage, late-night comedy segments. And with every passing hour, the silence of the Commons became more damning. People weren't just talking about Prince Harry anymore. They were asking, why won't Parliament say something? Was the government protecting him? Was this part of some backdoor deal between Downing Street and the monarchy? Was King Charles pulling strings to keep the matter buried? Theories mushroomed. Rage intensified. And the public, once content to sign and scroll, began calling constituency offices. Emails flooded MPs' inboxes. Where do you stand on the petition? Why hasn't this been debated yet? Do you support royal accountability or not? One MP, privately, compared it to a tsunami. Every time I tried to move on to local housing issues, I got slammed with Harry. And then, it happened. In a move no one predicted, the Petitions Committee, a relatively low-profile body in the grand machinery of Parliament, announced that it had formally acknowledged the Harry petition and was reviewing scheduling options for further parliamentary action. That may sound bureaucratic, but in Westminster speak, that was the sound of the match striking. Because once the committee greenlights consideration for debate, it means one very simple, very seismic thing. MPs may have to stand up, on live TV, in the House of Commons, and take a position on Prince Harry's royal status. And let's be honest, this isn't about just one man. This is about precedent. This is about poking the beast of monarchy with a legislative stick. This is about dragging the royal family, an institution built on mystique and selective silence, into the cold, scrutinizing fluorescent light of elected government. Do you feel that tension? Because Parliament certainly did. One senior MP from the Home Affairs Committee reportedly slammed his pen on the table in a closed-door meeting and said, "If we debate this, we are opening Pandora's box. You think it ends with Harry? Think again." But others disagreed. Some believe this was a golden opportunity. An opportunity to finally have a national conversation about what titles mean, about what it means to be royal in a democracy, about who pays, who benefits, and who protects. Backbenchers started whispering about submitting questions to the Speaker. Some MPs with royalist leanings argued for a broader framework, maybe a titles reform bill. One even floated the idea of a royal responsibility charter, a legal guideline defining the privileges and penalties for royals who exit the firm. It wasn't just a petition anymore. It was an accelerant. And then, just as the House was getting ready to return from recess, a leak. A quiet one. A single line, buried in a Sunday paper. Palace source suggests Prince William would not oppose Parliament debating Duke of Sussex title. Boom. The silence shattered. Let's break that down. A palace source. Meaning, not some random commentator, but someone with verified access to inner royal circles, was essentially giving Parliament the green light. Even more shocking, it wasn't Charles. It wasn't Camilla. It wasn't some faceless aide. It was William, the future king, the brother, the man who, just a decade ago, was joking with Harry in their matching uniforms at the Invictus Games. And now? Now his silence was replaced by the faint outline of approval. That one quote turned Parliament from cautious to combustible. Because if William, arguably the most protected and future-focused royal, wasn't going to defend Harry, then why should Parliament? Let's pause for a second. Think about that emotionally. This wasn't just politics. This was betrayal on a biblical scale. A brother refusing to shield his own flesh and blood from public condemnation. A future monarch saying, in code, "I will not stop them." What does that do to the narrative? To the fairy tale? To the idea that, no matter what, the Windsors would always protect their own? It rips it apart. And in that vacuum of brotherly protection, Parliament began to stir, no longer hesitantly, but hungrily. MPs started issuing subtle statements. One wrote, "Every citizen must be held to account, even those born into privilege." Another posted on X, formerly Twitter, "Titles are not souvenirs. They're sacred. If you reject your duties, expect the consequences." Even Lord Balfour, a rarely quoted hereditary peer, gave an interview on a mid-tier news show and said, "The Duke of Sussex title was a gift of the crown. Like any gift, it can be returned." Still, it wasn't just political posturing. It wasn't just theater. Behind closed doors, real strategies were taking shape. Government lawyers began reviewing the Titles Deprivation Act of 1917, a dusty piece of legislation used to strip German-affiliated royals of their UK honors during World War I. Now, obviously, Harry isn't consorting with enemy monarchs, but the legal framework was suddenly relevant. Could it be modernized? Could Parliament introduce a 2025 version? Something clean, surgical, tailored to a modern monarchy plagued by PR disasters? One legal scholar called it the nuclear option, not because it would happen, but because just talking about it shook the palace to its core. And yet, the palace still said nothing. Not a peep from King Charles. No rebuttal. No support. No guidance. Which raised an even more dangerous question. Was the king secretly hoping Parliament would do the dirty work for him? If Parliament pushed far enough, if the pressure became intense enough, Charles could one day issue a simple royal decree. Henceforth, the Duke of Sussex shall be known as Mr. Henry Charles Albert David Mountbatten Windsor. Boom. Done. Bloodless. Blameless. And if questioned, Charles could say, "I simply followed the will of Parliament." It would be surgical and brutal. But this wasn't just about legislative hypotheticals or backroom strategies. Because in the middle of this storm, one voice rose above the rest. A voice no one expected. A voice that hadn't spoken publicly about the Sussexes in years. Princess Anne. The one royal who had remained completely silent through Megxit, Oprah, Netflix, and Spare. The one who, while others gave interviews, quietly rode horses, cut ribbons, and attended more public engagements than anyone else in the family. The Princess Royal. The steel spine of the monarchy. And what she reportedly said, behind closed doors, in a high-level meeting, was like a sword through the fog. If you abandon the institution, you relinquish its privileges. Simple as that. No emotion. No vindictiveness. Just cold, unbreakable logic. That quote would leak within 48 hours. And when it did, the temperature in Parliament shifted again. No longer a political calculation. Now, it was moral permission. Because if and the duty-obsessed, press-shy, no-nonsense daughter of Queen Elizabeth II was willing to make that call, what was left to debate? The thunder had finally arrived. But even as the walls of Westminster rumbled with rising fury across the ocean, in Montecito, something stirred. A new interview was being filmed. A carefully curated response was coming. And Meghan Markle was at the center of it. Because while Parliament plotted and royals maneuvered, the Duchess was preparing a countermove of her own. And what she said would reignite the royal war with more fire than ever before. What happens when the quietest person in the room finally speaks? And not just speaks, but slices through the noise with a precision so devastating, it leaves the entire royal court rattled? That's what happened when she spoke. Not Charles, not Camilla, not William, not even Kate, but Anne, Princess Anne. The woman the British press often calls the workhorse royal. The one who's been behind the scenes for decades, shaking thousands of hands, opening hundreds of community centers, attending countless diplomatic dinners, military reviews, charity events, without scandal, without fanfare, and without ever once making it about her. She doesn't give Oprah interviews. She doesn't wear designer gowns for People magazine. She doesn't cry on Netflix. She works. She serves. She rides her horse at dawn, does 5 engagements by lunch, and gives the cameras a brief nod before returning to obscurity. She is, in many ways, everything Harry and Meghan are not. And that's what made her sudden emergence into this escalating scandal so seismic. Because for years, Anne had remained a wall. Impenetrable. Untouched. Even when the tabloids screamed, even when her nephews were throwing Molotov cocktails at the monarchy from across the Atlantic, she didn't flinch. She held the line. Until now. Let's back up. Sources from inside the palace, ones who have never leaked before, claimed that and had recently attended a high-level strategy meeting at Clarence House. The purpose? To advise King Charles on the growing Sussex backlash, especially now that Parliament had formally acknowledged the petition. But the room, by all accounts, was fractured. William, reportedly furious behind closed doors, said little. Camilla, pragmatic and cool-headed, urged Charles to let Parliament run its course and avoid entanglement. Charles, ever the hesitant monarch, seemed paralyzed. Rumors swirled that he was emotionally torn between protecting the institution and shielding his younger son from complete destruction. And then spoke. According to one insider, she placed both hands flat on the table, looked directly at her brother, the king, and said it as clearly and coldly as a military order. If you abandon the institution, you relinquish its privileges. Simple as that. No theatrics, no sentiment, no compromise, just in being Anne. But the room went quiet, because they all knew what that meant. She was endorsing it, endorsing the stripping of Harry's royal rights. Not out of spite, not out of vengeance, but out of duty, and saw it the way a soldier would. A code of honor, a consequence of action. Harry had walked away, not once, but repeatedly. He'd burned the bridges, thrown stones at the windows, sued the institutions, and monetized the family. And to Anne, that was enough. He had chosen the brand of royalty, not the burden of it. And in her world, that meant one thing. You forfeit the name. When the news of Anne's words leaked days later, it didn't come through a tabloid or gossip site. It came from a quiet paragraph in the Times of London, an institution as careful and vetted as it gets. And it hit like a thunderclap. For the first time since the Megxit drama exploded in 2020, a senior royal, one with no personal history of scandal, one beloved by both palace insiders and the public, was officially, if indirectly, condemning Harry. Not with hatred, but with clarity. And the timing? Perfectly devastating. Because as Parliament prepared for potential debate, Anne's words gave them the moral shield they needed. No longer could MPs be accused of interfering with royal business. No longer could the petition be dismissed as a partisan stunt. Now, even the royal family was quietly signaling support. And Anne wasn't just any royal. She was the Queen's daughter, the eldest and most loyal, the only one who never wavered. Let's take a moment and remember who Anne is in the royal ecosystem. This is a woman who refused to give her children royal titles, long before Harry and Meghan claimed they'd been denied the same. She's a woman who, at 73, still performs more royal duties in a year than most of her younger relatives combined. She doesn't play the game. She is the game, and she never needed the spotlight, which is why, when she steps into it, you listen. Even Harry, by some accounts, was stunned. According to an anonymous source close to the Sussexes, Harry felt betrayed and blindsided by the leak. The source claimed Harry had always respected and saw her as the cool aunt, and believed she'd never go against him. But clearly, the rules had changed. Because Anne wasn't acting as an aunt. She was acting as a royal. And that made her dangerous. Let's explore the emotional contradiction this created. For the public, this moment was complex. On one hand, Anne's quiet condemnation was seen as a righteous stand. A long overdue statement that duty matters and that royalty isn't a celebrity club. But on the other hand, it also carried a sharp, almost chilling finality. This wasn't about fixing things. This wasn't about reconciliation. This was a line in the sand. Anne's words told the world that, inside the palace, they were no longer waiting for Harry to come home. They were preparing to erase his legacy. Think about that. The man who once walked behind Princess Diana's coffin, the man who once smiled alongside and at charity polo matches, the man who once held his newborn son in the royal nursery under the same roof as his aunt, was now being disowned. In code, in strategy, in silence. But why now? Why would Anne, after years of silence, choose this moment to act? Some say it was the petition, that the overwhelming public support gave her the political cover to finally say what she'd always believed. Others say it was Spare, Harry's memoir, in which he didn't just attack Charles or William, but threw subtle jabs at nearly every senior royal, including Anne. There was a particularly telling moment in the book where Harry referred to some older royals clinging to ancient codes of duty and coldness. Many believe that was aimed at Anne. And doesn't forget. Still, her intervention wasn't emotional. It was strategic. Because here's the truth. The monarchy is cornered. On one side, a prince who left, but won't let go. On the other, a nation that's watching every move. And Anne, unlike her brother Charles, doesn't believe in half measures. To protect the crown, she knew there could be no ambiguity. Harry was either in, or he was out. And in her eyes, he'd been out for a long time. So she simply voiced the conclusion everyone else had been avoiding. If you abandon the institution, you relinquish its privileges. Simple, sharp, final. But while Parliament seized on her words, and the public debated their meaning, across the Atlantic, the Sussex machine was firing up. Because Meghan Markle had just filmed an interview. And though it hadn't aired yet, whispers began to leak. Whispers of coded barbs. Whispers of veiled threats. Whispers of a woman preparing to strike back. Not just at Parliament, but at the very idea of monarchy itself. Because for every royal response, Meghan had a counterstrike. And this time, she wasn't playing defense. She was going on the attack. What do you do when the institution you once married into, an ancient crown wrapped in protocol and diamonds, seems to be circling for your husband's head? If you're Meghan Markle, you don't wait quietly in the wings. You act, but you don't act like they do. You don't issue decrees. You don't whisper in oak-paneled corridors or leak to the Times. No, you fire your first shot the only way you know how. Through a glossy, high-production, carefully timed interview in California. Because if Parliament was preparing to strip Harry, and if Princess Anne had made her icy position known, Meghan wasn't going to stay silent. She was going to set the tone. She was going to control the narrative. And her message, though wrapped in smiles and platitudes, couldn't have been louder. Let's set the stage. The cameras were rolling in Santa Barbara. The lighting was warm. The backdrop was softly lit with florals and books about mindfulness and social justice. The tone? Polished. Empathetic. Professional. The interviewer? A well-known American journalist, friendly to the Sussexes, known for soft questions and viral pull quotes. But beneath the pleasant setting, the strategy was sharp as steel. Because this wasn't just an interview. This was counter-programming. Meghan wasn't reacting. She was positioning. And the topic? Royalty. Identity. Entitlement. Public pain. Private betrayal. From the moment the first teaser clip aired, the world sat up. Because Meghan, never one to speak directly, was speaking volumes between the lines. One viral quote hit Twitter like an earthquake. When you walk away from something toxic, some people will try to punish you for surviving it. Just vague enough to be poetic. Just pointed enough to know exactly who she meant. Then came the next blow. We didn't reject duty. We rejected dysfunction. It was a masterclass in linguistic judo, turning the accusation back on the accuser. She wasn't walking away from responsibility. She was running towards sanity. Away from rot. Away from rules built to crush her spirit. And in doing so, she rewrote the story. The petition? Painted as mob mentality. Parliament's involvement? Framed as performative politics. Anne's quote, dismissed with a knowing smile and a soft. People cling to rules when they feel threatened. It's human. But the most powerful part wasn't what she said. It was how she said it. Calm. Measured. Untouchable. She wasn't angry. She was disappointed. Which, in the modern media landscape, is far more potent. Now here's the twist that made royal insiders break into cold sweats. According to production staff, Meghan had final approval over the cut. She handpicked which soundbites would headline. Which meant this wasn't some spontaneous tell-all. This was war strategy and lip gloss. And she wasn't alone. In one segment, she hinted, just hinted, that Harry was hurt more deeply than people realize. She said, the burden he carries isn't just from the last few years. It's generations deep. Generational trauma, repression, cold fathers, broken boys. Suddenly, the narrative wasn't about Parliament or a petition. It was about pain. Family pain. Colonial pain. Institutional pain. And just like that, she flipped the board. Because now, if Parliament moved forward with action, Meghan's framing was in place. They weren't stripping Harry because of hypocrisy or legal conflicts. They were punishing him for breaking the generational curse. They were punishing him for choosing healing. It was brilliant, but also brutal, because behind that soft piano music and filtered lighting was a coded challenge. We know what you're trying to do, and we'll burn the illusion down before you succeed. And remember, the Sussexes play by Hollywood rules now. The interview wasn't just aired on a single news network. It was clipped, viralized, chopped into memes, spread across Instagram stories, TikTok edits, think pieces. One quote in particular trended worldwide. Titles don't define the truth. Integrity does. Sounds noble, right? Until you realize it's a direct contradiction of their actual business model. Because while Meghan claimed titles were meaningless, the Sussexes team had just renewed merchandising deals linked to the Archewell brand, clearly leveraging their royal mystique. They say titles don't matter, but their empire is built on them. It was a contradiction so bold, it became a feature, not a bug. Because contradiction feeds attention, and attention is currency. Let's dive deeper into the emotional manipulation at play. While Parliament was speaking in legal terms, titles, prerogatives, precedents, Meghan was speaking in emotional language. Feelings, wounds, narratives of survival. That's how modern audiences connect. Not with rules, but with relatable pain. And Meghan knew it. She didn't need to respond to and directly. She didn't have to mention Parliament by name. She simply told a story in which her family was the hero, and the monarchy was the oppressive villain. And people listened, especially in America. In the hours after the interview, hashtags exploded. Hashtag Stand with Harry. Hashtag Royal Vendetta. Hashtag Colonial Crown. In some circles, the framing wasn't just about royal fallout. It became a civil rights conversation, a freedom of speech issue, a generational healing journey. But in the UK, the reaction was different. Outrage, cynicism, fatigue. One British broadcaster declared, "They're crying from their $14 million mansion while the rest of us can't afford heating bills. Spare me." A viral cartoon depicted Harry and Meghan clutching Netflix contracts while sobbing into diamond-studded tissues. The cultural divide had never been starker. But Meghan didn't care, because she wasn't talking to Britain anymore. She was talking to the global audience. She was reframing the debate. And then, in a final twist of the knife, she dropped the bomb. People think walking away from privilege is easy. But what they forget is, sometimes, the real privilege is walking away. That was it. The last line of the interview. Clean. Final. Iconic. And it left millions with one question hanging in the air. Was that a farewell? Or a declaration of war? Because even as the credits rolled, sources were already whispering about a second interview. A bigger one. A sit-down with Harry, where he would finally set the record straight. And not about Meghan. Not about their children. Not about racism. But about titles. About the monarchy. About his right to be Duke of Sussex. You see, the interview wasn't the climax. It was just the opening act. Because while Meghan handled the emotional assault, Harry was preparing the legal one. But before he could strike, before he could unleash his next blow, something leaked. Something he didn't expect. A letter. Not to the press. Not to the palace. But to Parliament. A desperate, personal plea. And once it hit the public, everything changed. What happens when a man who spent years criticizing the monarchy suddenly realizes the machinery he walked away from may be turning against him? He writes a letter. But not just any letter. A private, urgent, deeply emotional plea addressed. Not to his father, not to the palace, not to diplomats or lawyers, but to the same British Parliament that was now weighing whether he should lose his royal rights forever. And somehow, that letter leaked. No one knows exactly how. No one knows exactly who. Some claim it was an intentional leak from Harry's own team, meant to sway public sympathy. Others insist it was a whistleblower in Westminster, disturbed by what they read. But one thing is certain. The moment it reached the press, Britain froze. And Harry's desperation was laid bare. Let's rewind to the moment the story broke. It was a Tuesday morning. Gray skies. Slow news day. And then, suddenly, an exclusive headline flashed across the Daily Mail homepage. Prince Harry begs Parliament for fairness and recognition in private letter. Social media erupted instantly. People clicked with morbid curiosity. Because this wasn't Harry speaking from a luxurious Montecito mansion. This wasn't a Netflix documentary or a staged interview. This was raw, direct, personal. A window into the mind of a prince who realized he might actually lose everything. Let's go through the contents of this letter, at least the parts that were leaked. It opened with a line that shocked even his critics. I write to you not as a duke, nor as a public figure, but as a son of the United Kingdom. The irony burned through the page. Harry, who had spent the last 3 years branding himself a global citizen, a Californian father, an outsider to the British system, was suddenly invoking his British identity. Why? Simple. Because identity was the one thing now at stake. And he knew it. Here's where the emotional manipulation began to show. Harry wrote about his military service, about Afghanistan, about representing the nation on tours. He described feeling betrayed by the public perception that he had turned his back on the UK. My loyalty was never in question. What I questioned was the environment I was forced to survive in. A powerful line, but also deeply contradictory. Because Harry's actions, stepping back from royal duties, exposing private family details, building a media empire off his royal name, made many feel he had questioned loyalty. And here was the first emotional punch. He wrote, I did not walk away. I was pushed away. And now I am being punished for surviving. Let that sit for a moment. Harry framed himself not as a runaway prince, but as a victim of circumstance. A man pushed out, ignored, mistreated, cast aside. But then came the plea. A plea that hit Parliament like ice water. I ask only that my birthright not be taken from me in anger or haste. Birthright. The very word he had spent years rejecting. He spoke of Diana, of her dreams for her sons, of her desire that they live lives of service, yes, but also freedom. And Harry wrote, chillingly, if she were here, she would ask that I not be stripped of my identity simply for speaking my truth. There it was. The emotional shield he has used for decades. Diana. But here's the twist. In the political arena, invoking Diana doesn't carry the same weight it does in the media. Parliament operates on law, precedent, public mandate, not emotional mythology. Still, the letter was clearly designed with a single purpose: to shift the narrative from Harry the aggressor to Harry the wounded son. A son fighting to keep his name. But there was a darker undertone in the letter, one that shocked even Harry's defenders, because later in the text, he implied something that made political analysts lose their minds. He suggested Parliament owed him clarity, safety, and recognition. He wrote, I should not be forced to choose between my safety and my heritage. Safety? He was referring, of course, to his lawsuit over taxpayer-funded security. But to many British citizens, the message was tone-deaf. He left. He chose Hollywood. He chose Netflix. He chose a life outside the UK. And now he was demanding, no, insisting, that Britain protect him anyway. The backlash was immediate. Phone-ins on radio stations were brutal. You can't leave your family, call them racists, spill their secrets, and then demand the British taxpayer keep funding your safety. Harry's not being punished for surviving. He's being held accountable for profiting off the crown. If he wants safety, he can pay for it with Netflix money. But the most heated reaction came when the letter touched on titles. Harry wrote, my title was not given to me as a privilege. It was given to me as recognition of my commitment to the people. The audacity stunned Parliament. Commitment? He had resigned from royal duty, walked away from responsibility, attacked the very institution that gave him the title. And now he was framing himself as a public servant wronged by the system. But then came the line that broke everything open. If my title is taken, it will not be the end of my legacy, but it will be the end of a bond that should have been protected, not weaponized. Weaponized. That was the word that lit the fuse. Because in one stroke, Harry implied Parliament was not serving the people, but was using him as a pawn. MPs exploded. One senior MP tweeted, Prince Harry is mistaken. Parliament is not weaponizing anything. The people spoke. We are doing our job. Another wrote, he wants the benefits of royalty without the obligations. That's not how this works. But it wasn't just the statements themselves. It was the tone. Suddenly, the severity of the situation was clear. This wasn't a polite debate. This wasn't a symbolic suggestion. This had escalated into a constitutional showdown. A prince versus Parliament. That has not happened in modern British history. But perhaps the most shocking part of the letter was the ending. Harry wrote, I ask for dialogue. I ask for understanding. I ask that you see me as still part of this nation's family. Do not make this decision without hearing my voice. Hearing my voice. The irony was staggering. A man who had spent 3 years broadcasting his voice globally, through documentaries, podcasts, memoirs, interviews, was now begging the UK government to hear him. But maybe the biggest contradiction? In his plea for understanding, Harry revealed his fear. Fear of losing the last remaining piece of the identity he once took for granted. Fear of becoming ordinary. Fear of becoming irrelevant. The letter exposed him, not as a confident Californian activist, but as a man terrified of losing the one thing he can never buy back, his royal status. And that's why the leak was devastating. Because whether Team Sussex intended for it to get out or not, the world now had a front-row view of Harry's panic. A prince cornered. A prince pleading. A prince realizing that Parliament might actually do the unthinkable. But here's the most explosive twist. While the public dissected every word of the letter, while Parliament debated its implications, while the palace remained silent, another meeting was happening behind the closed doors of Clarence House. A meeting that would shift the tone of the entire crisis. A meeting that would reveal how the senior royals truly saw Harry's plea. And the conclusion they reached? No one saw it coming. What happens when the monarchy, an institution built on centuries of quiet calculation, realizes that silence can no longer protect it? It retreats into its most private chambers. It gathers its most trusted figures. It closes the doors, draws the curtains, and confronts the unthinkable. A crisis that can no longer be ignored. That moment had arrived. Because as Harry's leaked letter ricocheted across the UK, and as Parliament braced for potential debate, the royal family could no longer pretend this was just public noise. This was a political storm, a constitutional wave, a public revolt, and the monarchy had to respond, even if only behind closed doors. So an emergency meeting was called. Not a public briefing, not a Zoom call, not a casual discussion over tea. A war room. Let's step inside it. Picture the atmosphere. Tense, heavy, charged with the weight of centuries. A long polished table, stiff-backed chairs, portraits of monarchs staring down from the walls. Elizabeth II, George VI, Victoria, George III. These were rulers who had survived wars, abdications, revolutions, scandals. And now, their descendants were grappling with a problem none of them could have predicted. A prince attacking the institution from the outside, while begging to keep its benefits. King Charles arrived first. He looked tired. Older than usual. The strain of the last months, health concerns, media attacks, family fractures, etched across his face. But today wasn't about speeches or sympathy. It was about survival. Camilla entered next. Not flustered. Not emotional. Sharper than anyone gave her credit for. She wasn't just queen consort. She was the gatekeeper, the strategist, the person who often told Charles the truths no one else dared speak. Minutes later, Princess Anne arrived. Still the same unshakable presence. Upright, focused, efficient, the eye of the storm. Then came Prince William. He didn't speak as he entered, didn't make small talk. He simply sat, folded his hands, and stared ahead. The tension between him and his father was thick, but the tension between him and Harry? It was volcanic. Senior advisors filtered in. Legal experts. Communications chiefs. Constitutional scholars. People who, until recently, never imagined they'd be discussing stripping a prince of his status. Then the door closed. Locked. And the war room came to life. For a long moment, no one spoke. The leaked letter lay printed on the table in front of each attendee. Multiple copies. Highlighted. Annotated. Charles finally broke the silence. "What do we do?" he said softly. Not a command. Not an order. A question from a father torn in two. But Camilla didn't hesitate. "We can't ignore Parliament," she said. "Not now? Not after this." William nodded slowly, eyes still forward. He wasn't there as a brother. He was there as the future king. And as future king, he understood something Charles didn't want to admit. The monarchy can't survive if it looks weak. And reinforced the point. "Public confidence is everything," she said. "If Harry undermines the institution and keeps his titles, we look impotent." A harsh word, but the only honest one. Charles winced, not at the politics, but at the personal sting of hearing his son described as a political threat. An advisor stepped in next, sliding a document across the table. It was a breakdown of public sentiment. 72% supported Parliament debating the petition. 64% believed Harry should lose the Duke of Sussex title. 52% believed he should lose all royal titles. Only 14% believed he should retain everything. Polling didn't lie. The country had made up its mind. But Charles still hesitated. "He is still my son," he whispered. And then came the moment that changed the entire direction of the meeting. William finally spoke. "He was my brother," William said quietly. "But he isn't anymore. Not in the way that matters." Everyone froze. It wasn't cruel. It wasn't angry. It was resigned. William continued. "He's chosen his path. And now he wants to drag us into his consequences. We can't let him." The advisors exchanged looks. Camilla straightened in her chair and nodded once, firmly. This was the moment they had been waiting for. For months, William had stayed silent publicly. He refused to engage in petty media back and forth. But internally, his position was clear, and now he was willing to voice it. A senior aide leaned in. "The question before us isn't whether Harry is family," he said. "It's whether the monarchy can afford the chaos he brings." Another advisor added, "If Parliament moves forward, you will be pressured to respond. If you refuse, it looks like weakness. If you act, it looks like vengeance." And that was the dilemma. Act, and fracture the family forever. Don't act, and weaken the monarchy permanently. But the letter changed everything. Because Harry's plea wasn't just emotional, it was political. He accused Parliament of weaponizing him. He accused the nation of abandoning him. He implied the crown owed him protection. To the public, it read like entitlement. To the palace, it read like a threat. Camilla summarized it in one devastating sentence. "He wants to keep the title so he can keep cashing in on it." A silence fell over the room again. But this time, it wasn't hesitation. It was clarity. And stepped forward. "We must make a distinction," she said, "between blood and institution. Let that sink in. Blood versus institution. Family versus monarchy. This is the line the royal family almost never discusses publicly, but behind closed doors, it governs their every move." And continued, "If Harry wants to be out, then he is out. We cannot hold the door open for someone who keeps setting the house on fire." It was the coldest, most honest statement uttered in the meeting. William glanced at his aunt, half admiration, half sorrow. Charles closed his eyes. Because for the first time, he understood. This wasn't a temporary problem. This wasn't a family disagreement. This wasn't a bad PR cycle. This was structural, foundational, a threat to the monarchy's stability. One advisor spoke up, a constitutional expert. "There is precedent for removing titles," he said, laying down a folder labeled Deprivation of Titles ACT, and nodded once. "We have done this before," she said. "Just not recently." William spoke again, voice firm. "If we don't act, Parliament might. And if Parliament acts without our guidance, we lose control entirely." That was the key. Control. The monarchy doesn't fear criticism. It fears losing control of its narrative. And Harry, ironically, was handing Parliament that power. But then, an unexpected twist. Another aide revealed something quiet but devastating. "King Charles, sir, other Commonwealth nations are watching this closely. Australia, Canada, New Zealand. They want to know how firm the crown stands on standards of conduct. In other words, if the monarchy didn't discipline Harry, other countries might reconsider their allegiance to the crown entirely." This wasn't just about a prince's title. This was about the future of the Commonwealth. Generations of legacy hanging by a thread. Charles sat back, absorbing it all. His son, his kingdom, his legacy, all colliding in one impossible moment. Finally, Charles spoke, his voice fragile but resolute. "I will not act rashly, but I will not let this institution crumble." A decision had not been announced, but a direction had. The war room was no longer asking, "What do we do about Harry?" It was now asking, "How do we remove his titles without destroying the monarchy in the process?" And that question would set off a chain reaction across Westminster, Kensington Palace, Windsor Castle, and Montecito. Because while the palace was plotting quietly, Parliament was doing something else entirely. It was preparing to escalate. And what they did next? No royal insider saw it coming. What happens when a symbolic petition, born from public frustration, suddenly morphs into a real political weapon? When Parliament, an institution that rarely touches royal matters, begins to flirt with the idea of rewriting the rules of monarchy itself. When a prince's personal drama spills so far into the public arena that it triggers conversations about constitutional reform. That moment came with 3 words whispered through the halls of Westminster. A Royal Rights Act. A phrase that shouldn't exist. A phrase that has never existed. A phrase so unprecedented that even seasoned political journalists struggled to define it. But here it was. A quiet, growing idea. Invisible at first. Now pulsing through committees, emails, meetings, and late-night phone calls. Could Parliament actually create legislation targeting the rights, privileges, and titles of a specific royal? Could they formalize what had always been informal? Could they force the crown's hand? And more importantly, were they preparing to? Let's rewind to the moment the concept went public. It happened during a BBC panel segment, one of those late-afternoon political talk shows that usually draws mild attention. A backbench MP, known for his brusque style, casually mentioned the possibility of legal frameworks to address royal misuse of privilege. The host blinked. "Are you suggesting a bill?" The MP smirked. "Let's just say, we're exploring solutions." That sentence, only 7 words, ignited a firestorm. Within hours, newspapers across the UK printed variations of the same headline. Could Parliament strip Prince Harry's royal rights? New bill rumored amid Sussex controversy. Historic reform on the table? And for the first time, the nation confronted a possibility that seemed impossible only a year ago. Legislation targeting royal status. Let's break down why this was so explosive. In the United Kingdom, royal titles and rights fall under the king's prerogative. Parliament can advise. Parliament can debate. But ultimately, the king decides. At least, that's how it's supposed to work. But what happens when the king hesitates? What happens when public sentiment crescendos? What happens when Parliament senses political opportunity? You get what insiders began calling, in whispered tones, a constitutional pressure cooker. And Harry? He was the match. But was Parliament really considering such a thing? The truth is more complicated and more shocking. Behind the scenes, several discussions were unfolding simultaneously. First, legal advisors began dusting off the Titles Deprivation Act of 1917, a wartime relic used to strip German-affiliated royals of their British titles. It hadn't been touched in over a century. Yet suddenly, it was relevant again. Why? Because Parliament needed a blueprint, a precedent, a starting point for something new. Could the government modernize the act? Could they expand it? Could they create a new category of non-performing royals? One constitutional expert described the concept bluntly. It's the nuclear option, not meant to be used, but meant to be threatened. Let's pause and ask the audience. What do you think? Would Parliament actually do it? Or were they using Harry as leverage to push the palace into action? As MPs began publicly debating royal accountability, the palace felt the pressure. Hard. Here's what unfolded next. A secret, unofficial meeting was reportedly held between senior parliamentary figures and palace representatives. It wasn't a negotiation, more like a temperature check. Parliament wanted to know, if this escalates, will the king act? The palace wanted to know, if the king doesn't act, will Parliament? Both sides walked away with no answers. And that silence was dangerous, because into that silence stepped MPs hungry for relevance. One Labour MP wrote on social media, "No one is above scrutiny, not even royals. Time for a modernized system." A Conservative MP responded, "Royal duties come with responsibilities. If you abandon one, you forfeit the other." A centrist MP added, "We support the monarchy, but the monarchy must support the people." It was bipartisan, unusual, unnerving. Something rare was happening. The political class, normally terrified of touching anything royal, suddenly realized that targeting Harry was not a risk, but a crowd-pleasing opportunity. Let that sink in. Harry had become a political goldmine, a symbol MPs could use to gain approval, airtime, and credibility. Not because they hated him, not because they cared deeply about titles, but because Harry had made